Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Dude 267, Longsight, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, and Mr. Black Rose. You are the reason why this content remains just insane, and that is exactly the kind of story that we're going to discuss today. For did you know that there was one occasion where a United States Navy submarine took out a train? Because it's a thing that absolutely happened, and we're going to talk about it. This is the story of the time the USS Barb destroyed a Japanese train. You can't make this stuff up. The Gato-class of submarines was built for the United States Navy, and they were launched between 1941 and 1943, specifically for World War II. They're notable as the first mass-production United States submarine for the war, and they were very, very close in design to their sister classes, the Boleo and the Tench. And in fact, that general design would be the ethos for most submarines constructed by the United States during the war. They were also quite large, especially when compared to British or German submarines. When submerged, they displaced a total of 2,424 tons, and their total length was 311 feet 8 inches. Their size actually meant that they had a bit of an Achilles heel when it came to submerging. They were slow, but they were not made so large as a show of force or to be visually impressive. It was done out of necessity, because they were meant to operate in the Pacific, which is vast, and the design ethos meant that they had to be able to carry enough fuel to go all the way from Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to the Japanese home islands, and back again. But the designs were considered very successful. 77 of the Gato in particular were built total, and one of them was the USS Barb. Barb, just so we're clear, was not named after a woman. The vast majority of submarines in those days were actually named for fish. Barb is short for Barbus, which is a genus of ray-finned fish. She was laid down on the 7th of June 1941, and was launched by the 2nd of April 1942. Her early career isn't outrageously notable, and she actually started her first operations in the Atlantic, not the Pacific. She carried out reconnaissance duties during the invasion of North Africa, operating out of the Rosneath Naval Base in Scotland. The following 4 patrols after the reconnaissance duties were against Axis blockade runners that were in European waters, but her 5th patrol terminated on the 1st of July, and she returned to a submarine base in New London, Connecticut, arriving on the 24th of July. Following a brief overhaul, she was sent to Pearl Harbor and arrived there by September. By this point in the war, the Pacific theater was much more alive and active when it came to surface ships when compared to the Atlantic theater, as that part of World War II had largely become a land war by that point, whereas the Pacific War was still very much island hopping on the open ocean. But even there, the Barb wouldn't really take off as a ship and a crew until she received a new commander in the form of Eugene Bennett Fluckey in January of 1944. His nickname was Lucky Flucky, and he proved to be an innovative and outstanding commander when it came to submarine warfare. Many of the tactics he came up with are still standard practice in the United States Navy today. Not only did he adapt the German method of wolf pack engagements with submarines, but he also had a habit of running the Barb on the surface until he absolutely had to submerge. The reason why this tactic was so good is that, even though this meant he could easily be spotted by enemy ships, it would give him a lot more time underwater if he waited to the last possible moment to actually submerge. Before the advent of nuclear-powered submarines, the time a submarine could stay underwater varied depending on the batteries they used. They tended to use diesel power on the surface, but when they submerged, they couldn't use their diesel, so they had to transition to batteries, and if the batteries ran low, they had to surface, which, if you're in the middle of a battle, is really dangerous. But with Flucky's method, it meant that generally, he wouldn't actually have to surface again until either the enemy ships were destroyed, or they were long gone. He was a capable leader as well. He had a motto: "We don't have problems, just solutions." And as nice as that sounds, he was also extremely aggressive. He tended to attack only at night, and he's credited with the most tonnage sunk by a US naval skipper during World War II. 17 ships, which included a carrier, a cruiser, and a frigate. Once when the sub ran out of torpedoes, he ordered them to use it as a battering ram. The man was out of control, but his tactics worked. he really upped the game when it came to the 12th and final patrol of the USS Barb, which took place on the 8th of June 1945. Prior to the patrol, she had been on base for overhaul and some alterations, and at Captain Fluckey's request, this included the installation of 5-inch or 130mm rocket launchers. The reason why he wanted these is because the Japanese had been pushed back extremely far, and he knew that their surface presence on the water must be getting limited. The rockets were so that the ship could bombard the Japanese islands, which they did, to great effect. This was also the only time an American submarine skipper fired rocket missiles on coastal Japanese batteries and factories. But you really want to hear about the train thing. Did they blow it up with the rockets? No. That would have been too easy. That wouldn't have been nearly crazy enough. And no, the train didn't run into them, nor did they run into the train. As nuts as that would be, it isn't quite that crazy, although I wouldn't put it past Lucky Fluckey over there. While they were patrolling on the Japanese coast, they observed Japanese trains that were bringing supplies, weapons, and war materials to Karafuto, which is an island located in the north. The crew chief, Paul Golden Swish Saunders, who was a veteran of all 12 of USS Barb's patrols, assisted the captain in devising a plan to destroy a train. Torpedoes were obviously out of the question since the trains weren't in the water, and the rockets, if they had any left at all, probably wouldn't have been accurate enough to do what they wanted to do. So instead of any of that, Engine Man 3rd Class Billy Hatfield suggested rigging demolition charges between the ties of the railroad tracks with a micro switch. The plan was that instead of detonating the explosives themselves, they would leave it there like a mine, so when the train ran over it, it would activate the switch and cause the explosives to go off, destroying the train. Fluckey liked the plan, so he called for volunteers. Apparently every single sailor on board the sub raised their hand, but Fluckey had very specific requirements for this. Sending a shore party in their situation was an extremely risky thing to do. The United States had not yet attempted an invasion of the Japanese mainland, and they expected fierce resistance if they were caught. Volunteers for the plan had to be unmarried, have a mix of experience, and at least half of them had to be Boy Scouts. Why was this? Well, Fluckey himself was an Eagle Scout, as am I, and his reasoning was that Boy Scouts would be trained in how to find their way back in unfamiliar terrain. And being an Eagle Scout myself, and having attempted to discuss directions with non-scouts, I can tell you that, yeah, that's actually a fair call. Scouts with our training tend to be better at finding our way around than most people who have not experienced it. So I'm going to side with Fluckey on this call. Just after midnight on July 23rd, my birthday, 1945, not my birthday, the USS Barb sat 950 yards offshore of the southern half of Sakhalin Island. The shore party consisted of 8 men: Paul Saunders, William Hatfield, Francis Sever, Lawrence Newland, Edward Klingelsmith, James Richard, John Markison, and William Walker. They set out in rubber boats and rowed their way to shore. Right before they left, Fluckey had told them, "Boys, if you get stuck, head for Siberia, 130 miles north, following the mountain ranges. Good luck." He also made it very clear to them that he could not wait for them past sunrise. If the sun came up, they'd be exposed, way too close to shore to not be spotted, and they could not risk the entire submarine for such a bold operation. On shore, the men found footprints and paw prints that indicated there was a patrol in the area, which was alarming, but they still moved forward with the plan. 2 men hung back and guarded the boats to make sure they could get out quickly when the time was right. The other 6 snuck through the brush and tripped over a drainage ditch, then crossed a highway. They had to slip past a Japanese sentry tower to reach the rails. The lookout was apparently fast asleep at the time, so this was arguably the easiest part of the mission. When they reached the rails, they quickly attempted to attach the explosives, but then Hatfield felt a metal rattle and a vibration. A train was coming already. They quickly ran and dove into some nearby bushes to hide while the train passed. They couldn't afford to be spotted at this point, or at all for that matter. When the first train went by, Hatfield went back to his task of attaching the explosive. He stuck them down between the railroad ties and carefully set the improvised trigger switch in the appropriate spot. Since this was an improvised explosive, if he had slipped at all during this task, they would have gone off prematurely. And he actually sent the rest of the men back away from him, so if they did go off, he would be the only one who was killed, and they could make a run for it. Fortunately, that did not happen. He armed the explosives just as he was supposed to, and as soon as they did this, they immediately returned the way they came and paddled quickly through the surf to get back to the Barb. As soon as they got back, they heard the train's whistle. A massive explosion allegedly sent the train sailing 200 feet into the air. The fireball was large enough to be clearly seen from the submarine's periscope. None of the sources I've found, and I've read multiple, are very clear about which locomotive model it would have been that was pulling this train, indicating that at least on the US side, they weren't really sure. I mean, it's not like they took the time to check which locomotive it was. They got out of there as quickly as they could. The only thing anyone seems clear on is that the train itself was between 15 and 16 cars long, and it was a steam locomotive. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe it was a Class D51 because they were very prevalent, so it could easily have been one of those, or possibly even an older D50. But that really is me guessing. I have no idea what locomotive it could have been, and given the scale of the blast, there really wasn't much of a locomotive left after that. The crew was immensely proud of what they had accomplished, even taking the time to stitch a little locomotive at the bottom of their flag, as a nod to their little excursion. 2 weeks after the Barb returned from her last patrol, the war ended. Japan surrendered, and World War II was finally brought to a close. After the surrender, Barb was officially credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels, which totaled 96,628 tons. As a whole, she received 4 Presidential Unit Citations, a Navy Unit Commendation, and 8 battle stars for her World War II service. Fluckey would go on to become a Rear Admiral, and actually received the Medal of Honor for a separate raid conducted by the USS Barb. That's another story, but it was arguably just as nuts. He also received 4 Navy Crosses, and would continue serving the Navy for nearly 3 more decades, before finally retiring in 1972. In his later years, he actually opened up an orphanage in Portugal in 1974, and is often known for speaking fondly of the Barb. He even named his daughter Barbara. As he put it himself, though the tally shows more shells, bombs, and depth charges fired at Barb, no one received a Purple Heart, and Barb came back alive, eager and ready to fight again. As for the Barb herself, she was placed in commissioned reserve after the war on 9th of March 1946, and then decommissioned reserve on the 12th of February 1947. She would be recommissioned on the 3rd of December 1951 and assigned to the Atlantic Fleet and operate out of Key West, Florida for a few years. But she was decommissioned again on the 5th of February 1954, underwent a conversion, and then was recommissioned on the 3rd of August 1954, serving again until being decommissioned on the 13th of December 1954. It was after that that she was loaned to Italy under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. The Italian Navy renamed her the Enrico Tazzoli, and kept her under their watch for nearly 20 more years, but eventually, in 1972, she was sold for scrap, for approximately $100,000. The original crew of the Barb, who had served on her during World War II, didn't find out about this till after the fact. Rear Admiral Fluckey mentioned once that, had the crew known about this, he believes they would have bought the sub outright, and brought her back to the United States to serve as a museum ship, and in retrospect I think she would have deserved it. After all, her service in general is not to be questioned. The train is one thing, but even outside of that, she had one of the most outstanding records of any US submarine during the war. And it's a shame that she was cut up. But it still makes a great story, and she'll be fondly remembered for years to come, I definitely believe. Mostly because she absolutely blew up a train. And I still cannot believe those absolute madmen did that. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.